Okay, today we will be looking at China again. This time I want to explain why Chinese culture lasts so long. What is the forces that make Chinese people being able to read, for example, 1,000 years ago's manuscripts? So let's go back to a little bit. First of all, the Chinese people doesn't like Australia here or American here. The dominant ethnic groups are migrants. Okay, we come to the white people. The white people come to Australia about 200, 300 years ago. But Chinese people have been living in China for as long as everybody can remember. So they probably settled there about 30,000, maybe even more years ago. So there is a very different thing. It is indigenous to the land for a long time. The Chinese civilization, as we know it, first developed along the Yellow River, where the earth is soft and easily worked by very crude tools that they are referring to is the Laos Plateau. Laos is a very special soil, which is very crumbly and it's not very hard, and therefore it can be taken up quite easily. And that's also another reason why Yellow River is known as Yellow River, because the Laos soil is yellowish, and when it is washed down by the rain to the river, it makes the river yellow. So even about 3,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago, whatever it's called, the soil can be worked with very easy tools. Even using bamboo sticks can dig the soil quite easily. From the Yellow River, the Chinese spread both north, east, south, and sometimes absorbing original tribes until the time of Confucius, about 500 BC. So we are talking about at least 2,500 years ago. They occupy most of the country between the Yangtze River and the Great Wall. Of course, at that time, there's no Great Wall yet, and had developed from primitive Stone Age man to man who could domesticate animals, irrigate land, making bronze weapons, utensils, etc. So these are people always living on that piece of land for a very long time. By the time of Confucius, China consists of many small states ruled by feudal lords. While they were loosely federated under an emperor, it was not until 221 BC when the last Chinese federal kingdoms fell and that China was united as a single empire. That is the first emperor, the first emperor, Chinese emperor, united China almost 2,000 years ago, 2,200 years ago. The imperial form of the government lasted very short time, 221 to about, the imperial form, that means the dynasties, the emperors, the dynasty lasted until 1911, when the Republic of China is formed. The China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, is known as the builder of the Great Wall, which runs from the sea westward to the deserts in the Central Asia, a distance about as great as the from New York City to Rockies. The purpose of this is to protect the settled Chinese people from the raids of barbarians who lived beyond in the north. China has been defending itself by building protective methods. I know in other world, for example, in the West, people protect themselves by building castles, and the cities protect themselves by building city walls. But as a whole, as a country, the China started to think of protecting the whole Chinese by building the Great Wall. So expanding that protection idea into a country, I think that is quite unique. In the rest of the world, we haven't seen much. I do think there's a bit of a Great Wall in Britain, I suppose, but that was for defending the Romans. But I don't know a lot about that history. Dynasties do arose and fell. Throughout the 2000 years of Chinese emperor, we can trace a pattern of rise and fall. A dynasty would come into power after a period of war and famine, usually produced by the adequate governing of the people. So the last dynasty, during the last for dynasty, at the ending part of that dynasty, usually we can see the emperor becomes corrupted, the administration also corrupted, and the people are being tested heavily. And any small natural disasters will push the people over into a famine. When that happens, people need to survive, and they will start retaliation. And that retaliation usually can I mute everybody so that we can? Let me just stop this share so that I can mute everybody.
I think Pat's logged on twice. Is Patricia and Pat the same person? So if you close your iPhone one, close the iPhone one, I think it'll be all right.
Is that okay?
No, it's still logged on. The iPhone one is still logged on.
Wait on.
Okay, I will mute everybody. Okay. That's better then. Yeah. Okay, let's go back. Where are we? Yeah. So throughout this 2000 years, we can see that we have dynasty come and dynasty go. When the dynasty at the end of it, then it's usually the whole government is not performing well, and a little disasters will push the population over to famine. And when people need to survive, then they will rebel. And some strong men will eventually win over everybody and then start a new dynasty. At the beginning of almost each dynasty, the ruling emperor will be quite good in a sense. That means they are able to consider the suffering of the people. They will usually do reforms so that the country can grow further, and it will last up to about 250 years, around that mark. Then we will see some degeneration coming on, and then the dynasty will collapse, and then another war and famine, and then eventually another strongman come along, and that becomes a new dynasty. Now that process stopped in 1911, when what we consider the father of modern China, Sun Yat-sen, and not Mao Zedong, is Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen overthrew the last dynasty, the Qing dynasty. When the Qing dynasty is overthrown, then the emperor at that time gave up his throne and becomes a normal citizen. The Republic of China is formed. Today, Republic of China still survive in the form of the Taiwan government in Taiwan, a province of Chinese. And of course, we know that by 1949, Mao Zedong took over and becomes and formed the People's Republic of China. So today we have two Chinas. One is the People's Republic of China. The other is Republic of China. But for quite a long time, both these two governments agree that there's only one China. Of course, the current Taiwanese government doesn't want to acknowledge this, and that is where the tension is at the moment. Okay, as I said, once in power, the succeeding warlord will need to bring into his service scholars who understood administration and the keeping of records. This scholar was largely from a landlord class, the only class with leisure to acquire an education. I think this is wrong because I get this information from a website. The one way to there is one social mobility possibility in old China. In Europe, after the fall of the Roman Empire, the social mobility is almost stopped. The peasants who are working on the field have little chance to become rich and to move up any social class. But in China, there is an opportunity by studying, by education. So even for very poor family, they usually will have educations offered by the village. So the whole village will be able to provide some kind of education for all the young people in the village. If they are successful in their education, take the public examination, and they can eventually get out from the poverty. And when a person from a village get out of the poverty, the whole village will gain. And there is an incentive for the villages to provide education to the Chinese people. So when they build a government service, they will need some kinds of bureaucracy to help them. Several times the dynasty was formed by the Norman warriors. There are only 2 times, not several times. One is in the Yuan dynasty, or what's Westerner called the Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire obviously is from Mongolian, and the Mongolian also conquered China. So that is the Yuan dynasty. The second occasion of that happened is in the last dynasty in China, the Qing dynasty. They are Manchurians. The Manchurians again conquered the whole China and then ruled China for almost 300 years. So it is one of the longest dynasty as well. So we have 2 instances of China being ruled by a minority ethnic groups. The rest of the time, over the 2000 years, China is ruled by the main ethnic group, which is the Han people, the Han ethnic group. So what used today is an old civilization? That's a good question. One may ask, what good does it do the Chinese to have such a long civilization? There is a very real advantage, which visitors to China often sense when they cannot explain it. The values of culture and of being civilized had existed in China so long that they have shook right through the whole people. Even a poor Chinese with no education is likely to have the instincts and bearing of an educated man. He sets great store by such things as personal dignity, self-respect, and respect for others, even if he knows the history of his country and his native region only by legend and folklore instead of reading. Still, he knows it, usually a surprising amount of it. And he has a tremendous hunger and attitude for education, which is one of the reasons why the future progress of China, once it's freed from the foreign aggression, is likely to be amazingly rapid. There's another interesting story from my mother. My mother has only 2 years of education, and that 2-year education is only provided by the village where my mother grew up. Despite she only has 2 years of education, during the Second World War, when my father joined the army, she is able to continue to communicate with my father using written letters. And of course, after the Second World War, my father asked her to join him in Hong Kong, and there I come. But after that, after my three of my sisters migrated to, after two of my sisters migrated to United States, my mother joined one of them in order to look after the grandkids, her grandkids. So she go to America, and actually she was able to obtain citizenship, which involved a oral language test in English. It's amazing how little education she has, is able to read story for us, and then even able to read and write fluently. When during the war, the only way of communication with my father will be written letters. So the education in China, in old China, is still remarkable in certain sense. I will explain that a little bit later on. So the main question I want to answer today is why the Chinese culture is the only longest continuous culture. So I want to emphasize is the longest continuous. There are to me, there are several different reasons. One is the geography. The other is the political system that is unique to this geography. In a sense, we can call China an island, like meaning that it is surrounded not by water itself, but by very difficult to traverse domains. That means in China's north is the stables. That is almost a dry land. So it is very difficult to actually expand into this hot, dry, desert lands. So this form a natural barrier. On the east is the sea coast. Naturally is a barrier as well. In the south is a very heavily forested area separating China from Vietnam. So that forest also block China from expanding into Vietnam. And the Vietnamese people are very self-protective, and Chinese can never include them into the Chinese culture. So they are very rejective of the Chinese culture, and therefore it form a barrier which China cannot expand into it. And then, of course, in the West, we know we have the Himalayas, and which is almost impossible to transverse by feet anyway. So China is very much an island, all surrounded by terrains which the Chinese people cannot easily pass through. So instead of drawing the land, we change it into sea. So we will see that China is actually surrounded. There is a line there from, you imagine a straight line joining Beijing and Qingdao. This straight line, you see that on the east side of that line is what we call the China Island. On the west of that line is what's considered as the China's backyard, which is not well developed. Still today, the main activity, the economic activity, is on that line's east, the line from Beijing, Qingdao, form an imaginary line cutting through the whole China. Then on the east side of that line, in the seaside, is where the main economic activities are. On the west side of this area, we have the other provinces. In particular, we have the Tibet, the Xinjiang region in the very west of it. And then in the middle, there are some other minority provinces. These are considered the backyard of China, which is not as well developed. Now, this is not only unique today, it has been like that for many, many generations. It has been like that for almost a couple thousand years. The main reason is the climate and economy and the availability of rainfall. The rainfall coming from the sea can reach up to about that line. Beyond that line, it's very dry. So that's why it had not developed very well. In fact, today, China shares a border with the most country in the world, 40 in total. Very few of those borders have ever been very permeable to migration of culture, commerce, and ideas because of mountains, deserts, swamps, and high altitudes. In many ways, China has acted as an island for millennia. What's left is the island of China. This is the traditional center of China of a fertile river valley for homing and the home to the Han people. It's also the zone of manufacturing today. It's where all its giants and cities lie. And of course, we have the Chinese sorrow, which is the Yellow River. This one view of the Yellow River, we see that the river itself is yellow. The term China's sorrow was birthed from the tendency of the Yellow River to overflow its bank and cause devastating floods. Historically, these floods has been fatal as millions of people have lost their lives. They have also led to a mass destruction of property worth millions of dollars. The most frequent flooding of the Yellow River was caused by the fact that the river collects lots of louse, the soft yellow soil in the louse plateau, a yellow sediment as it flows. The sediment settles on its riverbank. However, unlike the normal silts that only forms a thin layer at the bottom of the river, this yellow sediment forms a very thick layer. Consequently, water levels rise until it breaks the banks, causing flooding. Today, any flooding in the Yellow River will be disastrous in a huge scale because the Yellow River's bed is now higher than the land around it. So if the Yellow River banks broke, the water flows out into the land, nearby land, and the water cannot flow back to the river because the river bank is actually higher than the land around the river because of this louse sediment. Some of the worst instances involving the Yellow River in the recent past is 1931, 1933, 38, 1943. The 1931 the Chinese floods went on record as the worst natural disasters in world history. It claimed the lives of approximately 850 to 4 million people. 850,000 to 4 million people. 7 years later, in 1939, there was another flood that was caused by the removal of the levees that held the banks in place. This flood is man-made in the 1938. This is made to stop the advance of the Japanese invading army. The levee has been removed to stop the Japanese advance in China. And of course, it stopped the enemy, but it also kills a lot of people. But that's why the Yellow River is known as the China's sorrow, because it really causing a lot of headaches to China. So a natural question is, how can Chinese people live with this river? What they demand from the government? Since the Qing dynasty, there are two dynasties with very similar name, and one is the beginning, one is the end. The first one at the very beginning is formed in 221 BC. That's the Qing dynasty. And the last one Qing with an extra G is the Qing dynasty. The Qing, just being the beginning and the end of Chinese dynasties. So we have one question holding at the moment is, what will the Chinese people expect the government to do, given the Yellow River floods so frequently? So on the other hand, we are looking back at history, trying to look at why the Chinese government has always been a large government, instead of the government ideas we have in a lot of Western countries, considering the government to be an enemy or almost a necessary evil of the people. So in our Western government political thinking, we try to limit the power of our government by, let's say, a balance of power, independence of the legislature, judiciary, and the administration, etc. All these different ideas is actually limiting the power of the government. But on the other hand, China actually appreciates a very powerful central government, because only by a very powerful central government that the Yellow River can be tamed, can be controlled. If you only control one part of the river, say by a province or a village, if the banks of the other part of the river breaks, the flood water still influence you. So we need to make sure the whole river itself, couple of thousand kilometers long, is being maintained throughout. Local people can't do that. Local people cannot enforce the other regions' people to actually do the similar effort to maintain their river banks. Only a powerful central government is able to do that. And is able to mobilize when there is a disaster happen, the people to react to it. Now, we see that very clearly in 2020, when the coronavirus broke out first in China. We see the very powerful Chinese government kick into action almost immediately. The virus was discovered about Christmas time, 2019. And at that time, there are about 5 cases. They started doing investigation, trying to find out what's happened. By the time they know it is a new virus, which is about mid-January 2020, they have a problem in hand. But again, at the same time, it was very close to Lunar New Year. By 23rd of January, the Chinese government locked down Wuhan on the eve of the Chinese New Year. That is a tremendous amount of political will in order to do that. But after that, what happened? You lock down a city, then thousands of healthcare workers, thousands of construction workers, everybody flood into Wuhan to help the Wuhan people. Now, again, this had to be mobilized on a large scale. Wuhan itself will not be able to cope with the problem at hand, because patients are having new patients every day. In the order beginning as hundreds of patients, then thousands, and then tens of thousands. So no city, no matter what the size, is able to cope with that kind of surge of patients. Only now, when you have such a large surge of patients, you have the problem of the insufficient hospital beds, insufficient human resources to care for the patients. What can we do? The only thing we can do is draw all these resources from the rest of the country and pour it into this one city to help them solve the problem. And that's exactly what happened. And that is exactly why the Chinese have been doing that thousands of years. the Yellow River when it's broke, then the central government will mobilize, and then a whole army of people will flood in to help to stabilize the situation without letting it spread to other provinces or other places. In order to do that, there are several important backgrounds in order to make sure it can happen. One is standardizations. If your unit, for example, I have a nurse in Victoria. When New South Wales has a problem, can we send a nurse from Victoria to New South Wales to work as a nurse? If we don't have a national standard, we can't do that. If we cannot recognize the national standards of nursing, then we can't do that. But if we can, then it is possible for a state with lesser infection, not so much problem, help the states with serious problem by sending nurses, doctors to that state to have it. And that is what happened in China. You need standards. What the first emperor did was standardization. He standardized everything: currency, weights, measurements, even writing. At that time, just like Europe, different little kingdoms, different landlords, warlords have their own writing system. It is not standardized. Although they are very similar, but they are not exactly the same, not standardized. What the first emperor did is standardize everything. As much as if you don't follow, you are dead. He killed quite a bit of scholars. And then he also started the beginning of the bureaucratic government. He understand why there were different warlords. The warlords was given the power to have an army. And therefore, as the region grows stronger and stronger, the army becomes stronger and stronger. And therefore, the central government cannot control all the warlords. So what he, starting from a very selfish angle, he want to make sure that no other warlords is able to emerge later on. So he centralized his military power in his own hand, and then rule the whole country on its own hand. That comes a question now. How do you do that? How can you rule such a large area? Well, we need people to rule, right? How do you get the people? Well, previously, everybody immediately think, I will use my relatives, my bloodline, because bloodline will be most royal. But to the first emperor, he doesn't think that way. He said, no, we want to rule the country with the best people, not necessarily related to me by blood. I will hold the control of power, but I will employ highly qualified persons to help me rule the world. How do you find highly personalized, highly skilled, highly talented people to help to rule? Well, initially there was using a recommendation system. I'm very good. I can recommend somebody. I say he is very good, and then you will trust me to employ him. I say that's one way, using recommendations. But the problem with recommendation is I may be selfish, and then I'm corrupt. So I will recommend somebody to a high position in order to benefit myself instead of the country. So in order to avoid that, what's the next method? Examination, a public examination based on the ability of the people expressing how they can rule the country. So 2,000 years of public examination started in China. So let's continue, give a brief outline. So look at some of the details. Now, first of all, explain the difference between a aristocracy and the bureaucracy. Bureaucracy usually is independent from the government. It is it's not elected in the modern sense. The bureaucracy advances through the ability to serve the purpose of its, for example, we have the taxation office. the tax office head is not elected. He is promoted through the taxation system. So that's bureaucracy. Aristocracy is how the ruling class, but the ruling class at the moment, we have the ruling class by election. We believe that if we can elect the best person to lead. But in China, when you are an emperor, you doesn't consider giving up your throne to anybody else except your chosen son. And therefore, there's our question in China. The only selection they have is start the bureaucracy, select the best people to administrate, to execute the will of the emperor. So the political system of the imperial China, the system can be divided into the state administration body, the provincial administrations, and the system of official selection. The three notable tendencies in the Chinese politics includes the convergence of unity, that means a large government, the capital priority of absolute monarchy. Of course, you fight through your life and then you establish a dynasty and you are the emperor. You are not going to let this power go. So it is an absolute monarchy. And then a standardized method of selecting officials. And it started in the Qing dynasty, in the first dynasty, and then it has been carrying on and improved throughout all the dynasties in Chinese history. During the warring period, that is before the first emperor, there's a very famous scholar, Han Feiji, proposed the establishment of the first all-encompassing autocratic monarchy for the future of the state. During the same time, another scholar, Shen Yang, from the state of Qing, would enact political reforms into practice. The imperial system will eventually be constituted by the time of the establishment of the Qing dynasty, which introduced a system of 3 lords and 9 ministers. So instead of 1 prime minister, they have 3. And then they have 9 departments, 9 ministers. And they will be in different units, which force the system of prefectures, counties, standard units of measurement, currency, writing, etc., etc. The 3 lords are responsible, the chancellor, the imperial secretary, and the grand commander. So one is for the army, control of the army. One is for being the secretary, the main secretary, meaning the writing, and then one is for giving ideas. And then the 9 ministry is for the ceremony, for attendance, for guards, for coachmen, for justice, for grand herald, for director of different imperial clan, So we have 9 departments. Later on, it becomes 3 departments and 6 ministry and so forth. This has changed over time, so we are not going to concentrate on this one. So this is a flow chart. The emperor at the top, the 3 lords, and then the Department of State Affairs control the ministries. So that was a later format. This format had changed throughout different dynasties. So again, the selection, the standard of official selection by family history gradually developed into emphasis of talent instead. This method will eventually progress to form the standard of public examinations, to which this mechanism of cultivating talent would be institutionalized, making examinations a notoriously rigorous process to accomplish. What happened when you have a standard examination throughout the country to select the best people. Well, the impact is that every little village, as I explained, will try to offer its younger member of the village a chance to participate in this public examination. Because if one village boy eventually becomes successful, he will become a high-ranking government official, benefiting the whole village. Because after all, this person will be making a lot of money, and that money will eventually flow back into the village, and then the whole village will. So in China, with that standard examinations, everybody concentrate on education, and we heard that Chinese are very, very keen in education. Yes, we have 2,000 years of experience, because we want to educate our kids so that he will improve his life by moving up the social class. With a standard examination, that means we will have a standard language. The emperor is not going to do all the translation between different languages. It's all will have standard language. So whatever the standard language chosen by the emperor will be a national language, which will be unique overall. But every place still have their own dialects. So there is a contradiction here. How can a standardized language being pronounced differently by different dialects? Well, the Chinese language have this unique ability. The Chinese language is not pronunciation based. It's not pronunciation, and therefore we can pronounce the same word differently in different dialects. As long as your writing is the same, we serve the purpose of a standard language. At the same time, another two inventions occurred in China early in the stage: paper and printing. When you have paper, you're printing, you standardize your textbook. When your textbook is standardized, that means the whole China will read the same thing. When a new dynasty come along, now remember this new dynasty is originally also in China. They are not invaders, they are rebellion, and therefore they are carrying the language from the last dynasty anyway. And when a warlord wins, he will bring that language down to the next dynasty. And the language in the upper dynasty and lower dynasty is exactly the same, except two cases. One is the Yuan dynasty, when the Mongolian conquered China. Another is in the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty, when Manchurian conquered China. Mongolians have their own language. Manchurians also have their own language. To them, they now have a problem. Are they going to use their own language? And then the rest of the country, 98% of the people you are ruling, will not understand your language. Or you adopt the 98% people's language. The Yuan dynasty chose the first one. They use their own language, and therefore they only lasted 99 years. They can't last because 98% people cannot communicate with the government, or the government cannot communicate with most of the people. By the end, the Qing dynasty, the Manchurians, they learned that lesson, and they used dual language, both Manchurian language as well as the Chinese language as official language. And then they also allow the Chinese language to be rising up to the official language level, to official language, and therefore they last about 300 years. The civil service examination is for selecting government officials. It was first established shortly after. Actually, the first emperor had this idea, and this idea evolved until it becomes the public examination in the Sui dynasty, which is 500 AD, about 600 AD. The system comprised of an examination convened by local governments. So instead of everybody all going to the capital to take the examination, we will start locally first. Okay, local government have their own examination. If they pass the local examination, they move up to the next level, to the province level, and then we have a province level examination. And all those pass the province level will go to the capital, and they have an examination. Up to this point, the emperor is offhand. Okay, is to be administered by one of the three lords. Okay. But he still doesn't trust the exam. So the last examination will be those who pass the examination in the capital to sit in the palace under the invigilation of the emperor, and the emperor set the own questions, and then he will read the answers in order to pick the really good ones, in order to help to government. So the last step is the examination in the palace. After that, if you are successful, you may even become the son-in-law of the emperor. And of course, this system progressively improved to the Tang dynasty, further improved in the Song dynasty, and so forth. And Tang and Song are the two. In China, there are three dynasties which we consider very important. One is the Han dynasty, and that's why most Chinese is called Han people. Okay, Han dynasty is the one immediately after the Qing dynasty, and then the other two are the Tang and the Song. These are considered to be the renaissance of China, where writings, cultures developed most beautifully during those times. So what the education obviously will in line with the civil examination, and that's where the formal education started to develop. We have private educations, as I talked about, provided by the little villages, but central government also provide a public examination, and this started very early, even as early as 2000 BC. Very, very early. We have ancient kings known to be well educated because they need to govern a large country. They need a lot of knowledge. They have to only acquire that by studying. And of course, that also means the royal children will be educated. And with the establishment of the centralized civil service examinations, then the content get fixed. These are some history of the early education. We can skip through that. As I said, there's another two driving force. One is the invention of paper and printing. The oldest paper is actually about 2nd century BC, pretty early, but we ascribe to the current method of making paper to a Persian in the 2nd century BC, and this paper making is eventually obviously passed to the rest of the world, to the Middle East by 700 CE. So it's about 500 years after the invention in China, and then eventually passed to Europe and so forth. So that's the paper. Of course, different cultures do have their method of storing their medium of writing. For example, before paper is invented in China, they use bamboo sticks. Then we have the printing. Printing changed all the books. So initially they have the wood block printing. That means we carve the writing onto a wood block and then print it out the wood board. So that is as early as 200 AD. So we have very, very early printing. And of course, by then the 12 classics, everything, and text, and then we started to have a different class of people. The writers, the story writers becomes a possible profession because we can now mass produce books. And as I said, ruling such a large country, you need a knowledge. So libraries has been also been a very important part in the Chinese culture. So these are some of the dates there, referring to how many books, so equivalent books available. I'm not going to read through that. There's just information here. With the maturation of the woodblock printing, official, commercial, and private publishing businesses emerged, while the size and number of collections grew exponentially, of course. The imperial establishments got some institutes. These institutes have their different aspect of work. For example, one is focused on recording history. Chinese has been very careful in recording history. So I hope that explains why China has a long history of continuous culture. You got geography driving it, and then with government, and then with institutionalized educations because of public examinations need for bureaucracy. So that explains why the Chinese people view their government quite different from what we in the West view the governments. We all want to limit our government's power, but in Chinese, they don't. They want the power, the government to be powerful in order to solve problems they can't solve themselves. Okay, any question? You have to unmute yourself. You want to speak? No? No? Okay, then. See you in the channel today.